Bonjour et re-bienvenue.
Hi, and welcome back.
There seems to certainly be a lot of real excitement in the room, which is really good. I'm sure everyone is eager to share and hear the findings with the larger groups, so let's get started. The way we'll proceed is we'll invite one representative from each group to provide a 2 to 3 minute summary of their key findings and most promising solutions. Then I will talk briefly about the next steps before we all go on our way. So if I could call Karen Cooper, you get the honors of leading us off.
Hello, everyone. I'm here representing the roundtable on social inclusion. I'd just like to say that our group was very excited and hopeful about the possibilities that a national housing strategy offers. So we approached our discussion with some hope and optimism. We recognize that there's a need for a more nuanced description or explanation of what social inclusion is and what it means compared to what's in the current provisions that CMHC is working on. We need to address social inclusion for communities, for individuals, and we're looking for improved outcomes for individuals, communities, as well as nationally. And communities includes physical places, and it also includes cultures and organizations. We looked at 17 challenges that we identified. We narrowed it down to a combination of those challenges into 5 areas. We came up with several solutions that we proposed for discussion and debate. And the first solution is growing the housing supply. We think that by increasing the supply of housing in Canada, that by that token, we'll increase choices for people. We're looking to expand choices for people that have low incomes and who need supports. And we're looking at encouraging solutions beyond pilot projects. We've had lots of pilot projects over the years that have been quite successful, and we need something beyond that now. We want to manage the demand side as well as the supply side. Look at what people's needs are and how can we best meet them. We'd really encourage the federal government to pool funding from diverse sources for housing. We would like the federal government to make this a political priority and to empower communities to build upon the existing capacity which exists across Canada and to build the capacity within its own federal government. We see the federal role as being one of leadership, bringing people together, sharing information, and certainly to provide funding. But it's also important that how the funding gets spent and where it gets spent is also important. So we're looking for the federal government to find better ways to build upon the existing resources, to support CMHC, to set up a housing secretariat, and to provide certainty in its funding. That would go a long way to helping the housing situation in Canada. We would like to see the federal government require their various departments to indicate how they support the national housing strategy and to provide public transparency around that. In a nutshell, social inclusion boils down to choices. We need better choices and we need more choices so that everyone has a place that meets their needs to live in the community across Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Session 2, which was maintaining and preserving existing rental housing, will have Graham Stewart report.
Hello, everyone. Well, we had a fantastic session. It's a really important topic and one sort of dear to my heart, and everyone in our sessions. It was quite lively. We had private sector providers, we had social sector providers, we had researchers, we had consultants, we had sort of everyone in the room we needed. This topic is pretty key to the future sort of sustainability of the housing sector. One thing that people don't realize or they don't really think of, people tend to think of a single-family home or a bungalow when they think of Canadian housing, but Canada actually has a significant number in the order of millions of apartment units that were built between 1950 and 1980. Some of them were very large tower blocks you see all over the country, and in a place like Toronto there's almost 2,000 of them, so it really defines the cities and defines sort of the urban landscapes that we live in, and it's home for millions of people. These were built very intentionally and through a series of sort of very clever supply-side subsidies from CMHC and other sort of arms of the government, starting in the 1960s, which enabled a really robust private sector to build, these hundreds of thousands and millions of units, and also to be able to build, the 750,000 or so social units that we sort of have throughout the country. So this is vital housing, and as this housing is aged, it's reaching sort of its 50th, 60th birthday. A lot of it is now becoming somewhat distressed assets and is also housing some of the most vulnerable people. I think the statistic, which is pretty alarming, is that about 1.5 million Canadians are living in this housing well beyond the kind of affordability threshold. So in the social sector, this is our social housing, and within the private sector, the sort of the bottom margins of the private sector, this is the sort of shadow social market. If you're on a waiting list, this is the housing you're generally staying in. So one of the things that we really looked at carefully was, what is the state of this housing and how can it be sustainable? How can it last for another generation? So these are good buildings. They can last another life cycle. They're at the end of their first life cycle. And how do we reinvest? And one of the big paradoxes is that there's a series of deferred maintenance over decades, which means that it's a significant capital is required to make this housing viable for the next generation and to meet our housing standards. But the challenge, especially in the private sector, is how do you bring significant capital to this housing without raising rents, when the entire sort of formula is, you raise your rents, that's how you get your capital and you go there. So there's an affordability challenge and a bit of a paradox, an investment paradox. On the social side, there's a whole series of agreements that are coming up for renewal, which are putting a lot of pressure on how is it financially viable to have co-ops and other sort of social sector housing. So we looked at this challenge. We looked at a litany of challenges, but the main one is, how do we invest in this housing while maintaining affordability? There's sort of some other aspects of this too. It's not just about maintaining this housing stock, which is crucial. How do we improve this housing stock in a way that we can make it more sustainable, make it address sort of the housing needs of different population groups, families aging in place, maybe types of housing that wasn't originally thought to provide for. And so like the last group, we probably had 30 solutions or something on the table and lots of good debates. But we kind of found that they were thematic, and we put them into sort of 3 buckets. And so the first is the notion of, how do we bring significant amount of capital to this housing stock, especially to the distressed assets? So how do we look at the portfolio, which are the most distressed, and how do we bring the money to the table needed to bring them up to our performance criteria? And it's not just about bringing them up to base standard. How do we elevate beyond base standard to deal with opportunities of environmental sustainability, improved housing quality, comfort, health, et cetera. And so the way to do that is a variety of alternative finance sources. There's an investment ceiling that most of these have currently sort of in the market as is. So how do we bring low interest loans, sort of below market loans, potentially zero interest loans, and potentially performance-based granting to the table, to say that if you make certain improvements and you go above and beyond expectation, more attractive tools would be available to incent the market to go in that direction. And so it's quite a large number that we would be looking at in terms of the money required. But what are the ways of doing it through financing that CMHC and other arms of the government would have at its disposal? The other piece is about affordability. So we're bringing a lot of new money to the table to improve this housing stock. How do we deal with market fluctuations in the private sector and be able to maintain the affordability in the social sector? And so one way of doing that is maintaining rent supplement agreements that the social sector currently has, and potentially looking at rent supplements for individuals in the private sector when they're looking at dealing with rent increases. The other thing about a rent supplement is it gives the operators the ability to be sustainable. They can raise the money through rents they need to actually have a viable business without it impacting the most vulnerable. And the last was about the future sustainability and the operating sustainability of the stock. If some of it now are distressed assets, how do we make sure they don't become distressed assets in the future? So really it's about an ongoing commitment and provisions for an ongoing commitment for those elevated performance expectations. And there's lots more to talk about, but I think that's our summary. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Graham. The next session was on housing needs data. So Andy Yan will come and brief us. Using technology.
Technology, we're trying to. Hopefully this won't collapse on me. Hello, everybody, and I was part of the housing needs data panel, and of course, it's depending on how you read that title, I think it was a kind of key point of really our conversations within a very learned group of practitioners and officials. I think really the discussion kind of begins with the recognition that there is very much a federal role in terms of data and on how it monitors Canada's housing stock. That very much we're talking about creating having a standardization of data across the various levels of government, whether it's the municipal to regional to provincial to federal, that there's very much a relationship that the federal government can play. We also talked about better clarity on data when it comes to evaluating outcomes, as well as having really up-to-date and a modernization of concepts such as affordability. Specifically, when we talk about affordability, the relationship between affordability, transportation, and jobs. And I think it's also coming into that discussion of data that we talk about the establishment of measures of success. That is specifically what does winning look like in terms of a national household strategy and in outcomes that can be attained in a short, intermediate, and long term. When we look at very specific elements of data, we really talked about, and much of the conversation really focused on a linked longitudinal and cross-sectional data set in terms of looking at both households and structures in Canada's housing environment. And that from here, that we talked about creating, and this is a very focused discussion, creating a data framework and a portal to easily access existing housing data sources. That it's not necessarily just about creating new methods and new data sources, but then working with data sources that are already here. For example, the new census, and how it's really a discussion of how do we share the information we already have across numerous organizations, from CMHC to the Bank of Canada to other agencies, that really it's the opportunity to share that we can have a series of low-hanging fruit. And in our particular framework, that discussion of a data tools. We came out with 8 tools and approaches. That discussion of a web portal was key in what our recommendations. But I think in ending this, it's really not only talking about data needs, it's really going down to really the issue of what is the question. And it's really from what is the question that it shapes data needs for housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Next up is seniors housing, and we have Greg Christensen.
Just going to refer to my little machine here, but yeah, on the topic of seniors and seniors housing, about 4 or 5 really key takeaways would summarize the morning. Really good discussion, of course. One is the integration of health into housing, that you can't really look at seniors housing as a housing issue. When you get into aging in place principles and you're trying to accommodate people in a residential environment and keep them out of very costly institutional environments, you have to bring into the discussions health. It's a completely different industry. Things completely different in the housing industry. It's usually from a nursing or a care background, and there's liability management. So the challenge, I guess, is to integrate that. There are successful models that are being done, and much discussion and many people in support of aging in place as an overall principle. The discussion that people don't want to move into institutional, that people often wait till the 11th hour before they make their change. How do you build in building features, wider doorways, and other things that improve mobility, larger bathrooms, in a market economy when people don't really want to pay for those things and really are concerned about them until they actually have a breakdown of some sort physically or in their family. We talked about the idea that when we talk about seniors housing, there's sort of 3 legs to that stool. There's, as I mentioned, there's the community. You can have a barrier-free house, and if you can't cross the street or get to the grocery store or get around your community, you've really got an ineffectual strategy. And increasingly, progressive providers of housing on the not-for-profit or profit sector are looking at their staffing and how do they integrate staffing into these housing models. Initially, you don't need staff. Initially, current models rely on leverage of family and spouse, and those are good models. But then as people age and the burden of looking after a loved one becomes very stressful and sometimes costly, there are reports where, you know, informal caregivers don't live as long as the person that they are caring for. So the idea of integrating service workers, care workers, education, and I think those that know their statistics know not only are the demographics of the number of seniors in our society growing, the number of workers per senior is going from something like 6.4 worker per senior to 2.3 worker per senior. So affordable housing needs to be cohabitating with seniors housing. The concept of urban villages where you put affordable housing next to seniors housing. There's three potential benefits of more compact, walkable communities. One, it's a sort of a public health benefit. If you walk, it reduces dependency upon automobile, which is a cost in housing, and also is good for the environmental greenhouse gas side. So affordability remains an imperative, a priority for seniors and seniors housing. Particularly the elephant in the bed is care. For those who don't think about such things, like I know in Alberta it's costing up to $4 million to build a hospital bed and $1,500 per day, and full-time care for in the home is roughly $28,000 per month. So clearly we're not going to solve societal problems with that model. We still need acute care, but we need it focused on the issues it's intended to deal with. We talked about incentives versus regulation. It's very hard to create a prescriptive model where you add more and more regulations forcing people to do things. I think the discussion was around incentives and how do you incentive good behavior. And there's already in the system many incentives against affordable seniors housing. Quick examples are zoning. Municipal bylaws aren't set up for seniors housing. They're set up for the 80s and the 90s, and things like underground parking and requiring a lot of parking stalls and zoning bylaws when seniors don't drive is actually a tax on affordability. Bylaws that require or restrict how many units per acre. Seniors units are much smaller, so none of these bylaws are written to accommodate that marketplace. There's issues in building codes, that a regulatory environment that will need adaptation. One issue is fire safety. Building codes are designed for what we'll call the people, the majority of us in the room, to exit. When you move slow or you have mental disorientation or you're in a walker, exiting from a third or a 30th story building is completely different. In terms of regulation and need for reform, things like property taxes, institutional models pay no property taxes, housing models pay taxes. And it was brought up by a number of the private sector operators. It would be remiss if I didn't mention, even CMHC, bless their soul, mortgage underwriting is actually punitive for seniors housing. It implies higher cap rates, if you're familiar with that concept, and higher mortgage premiums. And in many cases, I think it's a reaction to the fact that seniors housing is a great social responsibility and requires expertise. And so they've compensated for a problem in terms of management with higher and more prescriptive fees. On the role of the federal government, it is quite positive. Everybody decided there's a leadership role, one having a vision that we want age-friendly communities. The idea that we need to develop standards above building codes. Building codes are meant for structural integrity, life safety, and now energy, but they weren't really meant to deal with the 5 and the 10 and growing to 30% of our population that seniors and persons with disabilities represent. So the idea is there's a role for the federal government to work on site standards and building standards that would raise the bar, not just the sort of the minimalistic approach of the building code, which is a slippery wicket if you start trying to get into changing that in 5-year code cycles. I mentioned walkable communities, and we mentioned increasingly it's more of an urban planning issue. Proximity to amenities like grocery stores and giving up a car are things that go beyond the scope of just the building. We talked about there being 2 major segments in the seniors market. One, those that have equity in their home. I know the Alberta numbers, over half of seniors in Alberta own a home, clear title. But it was also pointed out in other provinces, Quebec, for example, there's much more seniors without equity in a home. And of course, even in Alberta, with 50% with equity in a home, there's a need for income supplement models and working with not-for-profit agencies and partnering and looking after seniors. Whereas in the market sector, there's many, many opportunities that are untapped. Life lease is a format where people use the equity in the home to reduce their rent, and there was discussion about reverse mortgages. So there was sort of a general feeling that financial tools have a role to play. There was a discussion, as we heard from some of our other speakers, about pilot projects, innovation, how to get the 5% to innovate, how to encourage those, how to share those best practices, how to change regulations rather than one regulation at a time, which seems to be a mug's game, moving deck chairs in the Titanic. It's more about coming up with better models and then sharing those better models and actually demonstrating to consumers these models and how they work. So there's a great deal of interest in that. But basically, I think the overall theme is leveraging resources, new models of urban development, selective densification, urban villages, site-based home care, the concept where you can have a care module in the middle of a community and you can look after frail seniors, but you can also have a site-based home care model where you can take the care to the senior in their home, and this, of course, is a lot cheaper than long-term care, institutional care. We heard about the gap between housing and long-term care in some provinces. We're fortunate in Alberta that we have some programs that bridge independent living in your home to long-term care, but I believe some provinces have virtually nothing to bridge that problem. So some of these solutions would be viable. But anyways, I think in the end, I think there's a general consensus that national housing strategy is a good idea. It needs to involve all three levels of government, private, not-for-profit sector, things like tax policy, immigration, as we talked earlier, for labor pool. There's many roles for the federal government on the area of seniors housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Next up is the Accessible Housing, Universal Design and Visitability, and that will be Ron Wickman joining us.
Thank you. Our group worked this afternoon. We focused on two major issues, identifying the key issues and challenges for the federal government, and then identifying possible solutions. We identified 6 key issues and challenges. First of all, the lack of policy, standards, and codes as it relates to accessible housing. The lack of information to assist Canadians to understand what accessible housing is. The role of the federal government in all of this. Canada enforces the Charter of Human Rights, but it doesn't seem to find its way into our housing market. Education and marketing, and then the big one, finding the money to make all of this happen. With the possible solutions in regards to codes and standards, we need some consistency in the code nationally. One way the government can help is in their RFPs for buildings and spaces that they own. They can demand to have accessibility experts on the team. We need to identify that seniors and young persons with disabilities often require different policies and standards. And we can create the codes, but they also need to be enforced, so that's a whole nother layer. In terms of the lack of understanding, we can continue the dialogue as we're doing today. We can identify best practices. We can get into training, either in person or through webinars. And we can also identify champions, those people that are making it work. In terms of the role of the government, they can provide money in regards to having initiatives for 100% visitable housing or 5 to 10% accessible housing. They can provide money for those that need to do renovations to their homes. They can provide tax credits and incentives to developers and builders. They can create a process that the funding gets to the homeowners quicker. They can identify best practices and what good accessible housing looks like. They can create training for architects especially in regards to schools of architecture. Myself having gone through that, there isn't a lot of talk about accessibility. More leadership in First Nation communities. We talked about a conference that would focus on accessible housing. And one of our members talked about CMHC getting back to the basics and look at providing housing for those most in need. In terms of education and marketing, there was talk of bringing the Flex Housing program back. There's marketing something that we could call Home for Life or Lifetime Homes, showcase accessible homes. Market accessible housing in the way that it is for everybody, all family types, not just persons with disabilities. In the United States, there's a program called CAPS, C-A-P-S, which is a Certified Aging in Place Specialist, so we can bring that to Canada. And we really need to create a cultural shift so that people understand that accessible housing, again, does benefit everybody. And finally, in regards to money, the government can invest in research and development. They can provide GST or tax rebates for accessible features, both in renovation work and new home builds. And some people identified that we need to also identify the short-term costs of creating or having accessible features in your home, but also the long-term savings that it will also provide. So hopefully I captured everything or most of everything that we said. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Next up, the last one is First Nation on Reserve Housing. We have Michael Rice.
Sego, skana goa, yoha hia giga, ganya gahaga najadoda. I am Mohawk. I want to thank you for being your spokesperson. I want to thank all my colleagues from today, First Nation government, consultants, and of course the CMHC folks. We're dealing with quite a different world where I come from. We have a different fiscal environment, different land tenure system, regulatory framework. It's almost like being in another country. And today the discussion is, you're asking First Nations to talk about housing, but most municipalities, they don't have to deal with infrastructure and job creation at the same level we do. We almost have to act like governments are self-covering everything. So it's a very, very complex issue. We listed many challenges, but amongst the primary ones we listed were generally First Nations are not in control of their housing situation. We don't have the real great balance between the government and the markets in our communities. And there are serious housing continuum gaps. The majority of First Nations are buried in Section 95 social housing and nowhere to grow beyond that. So there's no options. But there is some hope. We see where we want to go. We believe if we drive or control or any initiatives are First Nation driven, we can achieve things. We have found solutions in a number of our communities. We see in the future as well to building some transitional instruments. We can borrow from our counterparts, and I've seen some instruments at the provincial level and elsewhere, in my community as well and other communities. And as one of my colleagues said as well, it's one challenge, big challenge in First Nation communities whenever we do work on housing. We don't do enough measurables or measure them. People always do studies or try to implement things or go to conferences, but at the end of conferences, we just go home and there's no measurable or something. So we need to focus more on actually getting some results and measuring them. We talked about a multiple of solutions. I'm going to try to summarize it. Like you said, I was supposed to speak only 2 minutes, so I'll try to keep another minute or so. First and foremost, First Nation communities, we're not homogeneous. We're all different. The Mohawks and the Crees are different. The Huron and Anishinaabe, we're all different. We're not all this, we're same in one way, another way we're not. We cannot use a cookie-cutter approach with our people. And I heard, like what I heard say from the gentleman here, we need data. And I think that's very important to get some good data so we can make some responsibly based policies. Anything we do in a First Nation rule has to be grounded in a First Nation. Can't be from the top down. In terms of solutions, we looked at financing solutions. Of course, we want to expand and continuum. And we cannot tell First Nations they'll have to move to private ownership. It's a very good solution, my community, others, but some may just want to stick to rental regimes. As long as we say they should be sustainable, though, let's look for sustainable things that are sustainable. And also encourage them to own whatever they do. And for those First Nations that are too small, let's have clusters, or perhaps we can organize and provide financing or whatever services in these clusters. In terms of financing, I'm a banker, ex-banker, or still call myself a banker. And yes, definitely we need more financing, but I always encourage First Nations to put skin in the game to contribute their money as well. In terms of the players, of course you need the federal government support. And we need to work more closely with the markets, but also we have to engage the civil society. There's a whole bunch of players there we should be engaging. As far as what the federal government can do, well, they certainly can support us in the diagnostic phase of what we have to do for, where any First Nation goes, they have to diagnose where they go. We can't use the cookie cutter approach, so we can use some help there in the diagnostic phase. There's a number of multiple areas, but the underlying everything has to be First Nation driven if it's going to succeed. I want to put in a plug too for one area, even though I noticed people had more time than 2 minutes. We need some serious financial literacy training in the communities at the leadership level, the staffing level, and the membership level if we're going to move anywhere on housing seriously in First Nation communities. So I think I covered all the bases. I appreciate it again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. A special thank you for the people who had the difficult job of summarizing what was discussed throughout the day. So what's next? Well, CMHC will continue to support Minister Duclos by gathering, analyzing all of the information we're getting from various sources, including these roundtables here, and a meeting with national housing stakeholders on September 19th to create the pillars of Canada's national housing strategy. Le ministre Duclos diffusera un rapport.
Minister Duclos will disseminate a report, which we heard on the 22nd of November on the National Housing Day. He will then also announce the next steps, probably, and especially the call for approval of the national strategy for housing by cabinet. I don't want to steal the minister's thunder as to the date we should expect for the strategy to be launched, so I'll let the minister answer that question.
This opportunity to express our appreciation to all of you for being here today. I know time is precious and for sharing your ideas and expertise with us. We've heard some great ideas this afternoon from each of the roundtables, which we will be sharing with Minister Duclos and the Government of Canada in the next few days. Thank you for contributing so meaningfully to the development of Canada's national housing strategy, and have a great evening. Merci et bonne soirée.
Have a great evening.